welcome to the IR Update. Today with us we have Alina Plaia from MZUS. Hello Alina.
Hi, how are you, Amanda?
I'm doing great, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure, thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about ESG. With the most recent regulatory updates with the ESG reporting space, what are the most immediate changes that we expect to see over the next 12 months, Alina?
Yeah, great question, and very anticipated. A lot of changes coming up. So the regulatory landscape is rapidly evolving. All of the audiences, target audiences of stakeholders want to see information that's complete, accurate, and most importantly, comparable. So the reliable ESG reporting is now a corporate requirement. Again, it's demanded by stakeholder groups, but also regulators. We had a slew of recommendations, different principles, proposed principles coming out of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission's OCC, Office Comptroller of Currency, Federal Reserve Bank, FDIC published also last year its proposal, and all of these documents will likely culminate into an intergovernmental regulation, one document that will make disclosure on ESG, but in particular climate, mandatory. In the US, the requirements primarily touching upon different climate-related risks. They cover risks that climate change imposes on the businesses, as well as the impact that businesses, by virtue of living, breathing, and operating, affecting the environment. So the expected reporting, therefore, reaches far beyond just scope 1 and scope 2 immediate emissions of the business, but also most likely scope 3 emissions will be included as well. And that means that this will cover the entire life cycle of products and services that companies are offering. And it is important to know for all companies internationally, private, public, big, small, because the larger public companies who are global, they have to report on their carbon footprint, which does and will include in the US scope 3. But most importantly, also, they have to offset those emissions. So it's logical to assume that these large companies would want to partner with companies, with vendors, with providers that are greener, because if not, these companies will literally have to bear the brunt of the expenses. So that's why it's so important, no matter if you're a company in South America, North America, Europe, Australia, it's very important to realize that. And the climate and other reporting is already mandatory in the EU. European Commission, European Parliament already recently introduced ESG disclosure rules. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it's called CSRD. It expands the current non-financial reporting directive there and significantly broadens the number of in-scope companies. So before, only 12,000 companies had to report. Now these requirements apply to over 50,000 companies, and they span topics like human rights, environmental impact, climate change, and then double materiality concept that I mentioned earlier, which is what's important to your stakeholders as to how the climate change affects, how you affect the climate, and then what's important for you as a company, how climate change affects your business. And so the TCFD standards would be the mandatory standards upon which the climate change is reported, which are also aligned with ISSB standards that are incorporating SASB. As I said, global emission disclosures based on GHG protocol, which includes scope 1 and 3. And there is going to be a strong emphasis on transition plans. So companies will be expected to provide a high-level overview, how they will adjust their strategy, their climate strategy, and also their business in order to meet Paris Agreement. And also there's a slew of other things that are going into effect, such as responsible sourcing, which is including conflict minerals, Germany's Supply Chain Act, and so on and so forth. So I can go on and on about that. But what I'm trying to really emphasize here, that the globalization obviously is real, and it definitely applies to climate and ESG reporting. So just because a company is smaller, larger, public, or private, we don't believe that companies should kind of close their eyes on what's going on the ESG reporting front, because by virtue of them being present or engaging with various larger companies, they can be subject to certain regulations, or they can lose out simply on the business.
I think you covered this a bit, but can you explain more about which companies will be subject to the compliance?
Yes, absolutely. So in the US, none of the climate-related disclosures are mandatory yet, unless they are material under the current SEC materiality guidelines back from 2010. That's already been published and active. But all of the US companies that are US listed companies will be subject to compliance. It's just there is a phased in approach. The earliest compliance day would be January of 2024 for all of the guidelines that are coming out, and to be confirmed in the next 6 months, maybe even sooner or so. In the EU, as I said, there are over 50,000 companies now that would be subject to compliance, all large companies. Those who meet at least two of the three criteria. They either have more than 250 employees, which is obviously not that much in a global context, and then they have greater than 40 million euros in turnover, or they have balance sheet assets above 20 million. So you could see how Europe definitely extrapolated the audience to which these climate disclosures would apply. Also all listed companies, and that would also concern the non-European companies. So just because you're not headquartered or registered in Europe, it does not automatically mean that this company will be exempt. Any companies that are non-European but generate net turnover of 150 million euros or more in the EU and have at least one subsidiary would also become subject to the reporting guidelines.
And what companies can do today to prepare and adjust to the new expectations with respect to sustainability and climate reporting?
Sure, Amanda, that's a great question. And it's so important for companies to do the homework and to understand, again, the regulatory landscape and to at least do a gap analysis. I'm a huge fan of that expression as to where they are now, and if they were to comply, what needs to be put in place. So first, companies need to have an intimate understanding of the jurisdiction in which they operate, in which they do business, and which local regulations in terms of the ESG reporting are there with which they might have to comply, just like we just discussed. That it also includes product compliance obligation. There are so many products that are going under the requirement of being reported based on climate. Some products, for example, that combine in their production process some conflict minerals would be an example. Each jurisdiction where a business earns revenue or has certain levels of personnel or customers, certain regulations might be triggered. So again, the management, the legal and compliance department should be aware of that. And any new acquisitions, of course, need to be scanned for the requirements on the compliance. Also, companies need to become familiar with the reporting frameworks, and maybe we'll have time to cover those later. Do gap analysis, like I said, is what's required versus the frameworks that they selected. Definitely allow time, because some policies and procedures cannot be implemented overnight, and they can take from months to over a year in some cases. And probably last but not least is the understanding of what the carbon footprint is for the company, because when and not if, the companies will be forced to discuss their emissions and report their emissions, their financials can be impacted by the price for carbon. So either through carbon tax, if they're emitting too much, or by having to obtain carbon neutrality and then purchasing carbon credits or offsets. So that actually can have material impact on the bottom line. So overall, it's really exercise in risk management and not necessarily the eye-rolling type of exercise in, ESG or unnecessary ESG kind of exercises and analysis, but it's more, to add to the prudent management of the company. And this risk management with respect to climate and ESG should be done across HR, operations, procurement, real estate management, risk management, supplier vendor management, and of course, finance. And the way actually climate is being and ESG metrics are being reported, the notion is and the trend is to move that function under the finance and the regulatory reporting and report those in a consolidated fashion within the 10K if it's publicly listed companies, and treat every ESG metric as a true accounting metric to the extent, of course, it's material for the company. So as you can see, there are a lot of preparation that must go in there.
And many companies nowadays issue free-form reports on corporate and social responsibility. Can those be leveraged in transitioning to ESG reporting?
Yes, absolutely. No work goes unappreciated and unutilized with respect to corporate and social responsibility. The main difference between the corporate and social responsibility focused reports and ESG reports is the materiality and risk-based reporting. So ESG and CSR both assess business as a corporate citizen. The desire is for both types of reporting is how do we give back and do good, but the materiality is the number one kind of guiding principle and therefore measurable KPIs with respect to ESG reporting. But everything that companies have said in their CSR report, any kind of anecdotes with respect to their employees being brand ambassadors, any kind of, say, tree planting activities or support of underprivileged societies or providing financial literacy and things like that can absolutely be converted into very important metrics under ESG reporting.
Very good. Well, there are several frameworks available for ESG reporting, but what do you think are the most important ones to be aware of and follow?
So probably the most important one right now, which is in the forefront, is the TCFD. FSB back in 2015 commissioned TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, to guide climate reporting. And that includes, again, the risk management of the company itself, how the company manages risks imposed by climate change, and that includes building out certain climate risk scenarios or building out a path to net zero, and also guidance on how to calculate your own carbon footprint, what kind of categories to include, and that's largely guided by, as I mentioned earlier, GHG protocol. Because TCFD is being incorporated in every single guidance, as far as I know, pending currently, the SEC, as I said, Federal Reserve Bank, OCC, and others, and also TCFD and SASB are, for a long time actually, they've been cooperating and incorporating the disclosures. This is one framework that's definitely a common theme and sort of the best the best standard for climate report disclosures. CDP report, which is formerly Carbon Disclosure Project, is a golden standard that kind of has all of the I's dotted and T's crossed with respect to properly addressing all of the TCFD guidances and recommendations. So if companies choose to use the report as a guidance or publicly report through filling out CDP questionnaire, rest assured that TCFD framework will be respected properly. The other two frameworks that are also very widely used, one is SASB, which is now part of ISSB, and the other one is GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiatives. SASB right now is still much more granular with respect to industries and sub-industries on which companies have to report, but GRI is also moving in that direction, creating individual standards for certain sectors. Like most recently, for example, last year, they finished standards for agriculture and aquaculture rather than having a one-size-fits-all. So we're looking forward to them issuing further guidances, further frameworks on other sectors.
Very good. And as a last question, Alina, carbon neutrality and net zero. Is there a difference, and do companies have to develop these strategies?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. I'm glad you asked that, because there's a lot of confusion, and also there's a lot of resentment on that topic, especially against kind of in anti-ESG movement circles. So net zero refers to the amount of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and so forth that are removed from the atmosphere, and they have to be equal to those emitted by the humans or by the company activity. So the emissions that are removed must be in a similar region. So if you're producing emissions or from electricity or from your own operations in Malaysia, removing that in Antarctica probably will make very little sense, right? Or in Australia. So because CO2 destroys the ozone layer, and also CO2 is being absorbed by the ocean, it increases ocean acidity. It's best to reduce emissions by focusing on renewable energy, so reducing your own consumption and limiting the amount of electricity the company takes from the grid, and increasing the amount of energy obviously generated by renewable sources such as wind, solar, and to a certain extent even hydro. Another way to reduce it when enterprises can no longer leverage the renewable energy from own sources is to purchase virtual, for example, power purchasing agreements or certificates. That means that even though they cannot, they are taking some energy from the grid, they're investing and paying for green energy to be used elsewhere, and the certificates need to be properly retired, not to sort of double dip into the same green energy generated. Emissions reductions should generally follow a certain trajectory. Like I mentioned before, companies should build out the scenarios that would align with Paris Agreement resolution, for example, to decrease global warming by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So any company that was able to reduce its own emissions through renewable energy certificate purchases, anything else that cannot be offset can actually be offset by purchasing the offsets, and these residual emissions would be offset by high quality, preferably projects that focus on GHG sequestration, so removing carbon from the atmosphere, or on projects that are focusing on carbon avoidance. And the strategy overall should be crafted in a very careful manner, because there are a lot of projects around the world that focus, for example, on tree planting, in Amazon, might have high percentage of leakage. So the trees are planted and then half or more of them are dying, while someone 5 years ago or 3 years ago already claimed their emissions to be offset by the trees that are now dead. So there are some agencies, and also there are some standards like Vera, for example, or Gold Standard, that verify the quality of the projects that could be credibly purchased and used by companies in their carbon neutrality and net zero strategies.
Well, that was very enlightening, and thank you for sharing those thoughts with us, Alina. I learned a lot, and I hope our audience did as well. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope it was useful.
It was great. Thank you.